Hello, I'm Rida Fakhri with our weekly look inside Syria. It's been messy from the start, but now the battle for Syria has been further complicated by the official involvement of al-Qaeda with one of the major rebel groups fighting the government in Damascus. On Wednesday, the head of al-Nusra front in Syria formally pledged allegiance to the al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. The establishment of al-Nusra was announced in January of 2012. Like al-Qaeda, it has used car bombs and suicide attacks in its efforts to bring down the Assad government. The group is estimated to have around 5,000 members, believed to be largely funded and trained by al-Qaeda in Iraq. In December, the US State Department put al-Nusra on its list of terrorist organizations. It said the group was responsible for hundreds of attacks and the deaths of countless civilians. Meanwhile, Western leaders are still struggling to decide what their next move should be to try to break the impasse in Syria. At a meeting of G8 foreign ministers, France and Britain renewed their push to send arms to Syrian rebel fighters. But their efforts were overshadowed by the al-Nusra announcement. Al-Jazeera's Lawrence Lee was there.
In the final communique that they've been giving out, you see exactly how difficult it is. It's very narrow. There's absolutely nothing for a start about arming the opposition. After all, the Russians, for one, won't have it. The Chinese aren't here, but nor would they. And there's an increased problem as well for the British and the Americans who are here about arming an opposition that now contains al-Nusra linked to al-Qaeda. And they've been briefing behind the scenes here that although formally there's nothing off the table, they say that people like us have to accept how difficult it would be to sell the idea of arming an opposition that may be linked to the Free Syrian Army, but also is linked to al-Qaeda. They simply can't sell that idea domestically. And so instead, the communique leans much more heavily on the idea of a political transition, an idea backed heavily by the United Nations Security Council that they say meets the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people. But even in that, there are all sorts of problems, because what are the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people? For the British, and they say the Americans and probably the French and the Germans as well, that's a future without Bashar al-Assad. But for the Russians, it absolutely does contain him, so they can't even agree on that.
Let's discuss these latest developments with our guests in London. Shiraz Maher from King's College International Center for the Study of Radicalization. In Washington, retired General Jack Keane. He's a former four-star general and U.S. Army Vice Chief of Staff. And here in the studio is Louis Safi, a member of the opposition Syrian coalition. Let me begin with you, Mr. Safi. What everyone has long suspected is now out in the open. Last year, when the United States government put the al-Nusra front on its list of terrorist organizations, your leadership, Mu'azz al-Khatib, sharply criticized the U.S. for this decision. In fact, even asked the administration to rescind its decision. Now, al-Nusra has pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. What is your position? Do you condone or do you condemn this alliance?
No, we condemn, we reject it completely. Everybody in the opposition wish that they would not hear that news because of the complication of the situation in Syria. But definitely we have a big problem by the announcement and the allegiance to al-Zawahiri and al-Qaeda.
But are you ready to denounce al-Nusra? Are you ready to break your collaboration with this group, given what we now know, that they have sworn allegiance to al-Qaeda?
Well, Mr. Khatib, the head of the coalition, has made it clear that their way is away from ours. I mean, there is no way to connect. Now, the challenge is how to deal with the situation, given the complexity and the fact that we have now a major terrorist organization, which is the forces of al-Assad. We have to deal with that.
But hold on for a moment, though. Mu'azz al-Khatib had once described them as brothers in arms fighting for the same cause. It is clear now that al-Nusra shares the al-Qaeda ideology. It's one thing to denounce and criticize the al-Qaeda ideology. It's quite another to denounce al-Nusra. Are you ready to break your collaboration with them, or is it going to be business as usual?
Well, let me put it this way. Now, when Mr. Khatib and, in fact, George Sabra as well have said these are our brothers, they have not really declared themselves to be part of al-Qaeda. And to be honest with you, most people in the opposition didn't know who they are.
But the question is, now they have. Are you willing now to take a different position?
Absolutely. That's what I said.
What
absolutely.
What is your position now?
The position has to be discussed. I mean, the strategy has to be discussed. But what we have made it clear, since they made the announcement, that this is unacceptable. We don't accept any group fighting with the opposition that have allegiance to Al-Qaeda.
Well, Khatib is making somewhat of a U-turn, it would seem, right now, by calling on rebel fighters, incidentally, to take a clear stand against the Al-Qaeda ideology, which General Keane perhaps reflects the lack of control of the political opposition over fighters on the ground. What have the recent announcement of this week linking Al-Qaeda with Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda in Iraq with Al-Nusra, what has it done to the larger picture? Has it further complicated it or further clarified it from a U.S. perspective?
Well, I think it just has officially recognized what we've known for some time, that Al-Nusra and the fighters, the Al-Qaeda fighters out of Iraq have been aligned and they've been helping one another. I think it's been pretty much common knowledge. Now it's out there in the public. I'm glad it is because I think it's something clearly the opposition group in Syria, the opposition forces have to deal with. I think this organization should be isolated from the larger effort. I don't, for the life of me, understand how we could go forward with an Al-Qaeda organization which swears allegiance to the goals and objectives of Al-Qaeda, a fundamental terrorist organization, one of the worst in the world, now associated with the opposition group to overthrow Assad.
Many, General Keane, would argue that this is the only way Assad can be overthrown militarily, that Al-Nusra represents the most potent, the most organized, best funded and best equipped of all the armed rebel groups in Syria. The Syrian government, the Syrian National Coalition, has refused so far to clearly distance itself from Al-Nusra. Will that compel the US and European countries then to change, perhaps to review their strategy toward the Syrian National Coalition, given the fact that there is still this lack of willingness to denounce the group?
Well, I think it's going to have an adverse impact. Listen, you know as well as I do, we've had the entire national security team of the United States make a recommendation to President Obama. This is Secretary Clinton, this is Director Petraeus, Secretary Panetta, when all of those were in office, and the Chairman of Joint Chiefs, to provide lethal aid to the opposition groups in Syria, and certainly it was the more moderate groups that they had in mind. And I also believe that Secretary Kerry, while not announcing a policy like that, I believe he has leanings towards it, and I'm hopeful that our government will eventually do that. But this complicates it rather dramatically if the opposition group does not speak out forcefully against this Al-Qaeda relationship.
But what about Washington and speaking out more clearly about what it wants to see happen in Syria? Does Washington, in fact, even have a clear strategy? Isn't it playing with fire, essentially, by reportedly training rebels from within the so-called Free Syrian Army in Jordan and sending them into Syria, knowing full well that these very same rebels that the US is training could one day take up the fight alongside Al-Nusra? And there are already reports today that some combatants have actually joined forces with Al-Nusra because they are better equipped and better funded.
Well, in my view, I mean, the United States does not have a very good policy here and no strategy to do what they want to do, which is have Assad removed. And the fact of the matter is we have a military stalemate between Assad and the opposition forces, and as long as he has air power that he's able to use, the opposition forces will not be able to successfully lay siege to Damascus or to Aleppo. They cannot sustain the logistics and the ammunition that's necessary to do something like that over a period of time while Assad has his air power. We would have to shut that down as well as provide lethal aid. We do not have a clear stated policy here, and I think this is why the suffering has gone on for so long. I don't believe the United States is the solution to everybody's problem in the world, but in this particular region of the world, as volatile as it is, I do think we have vital national interest to help maintain stability. The people of Syria are speaking out, they're risking their lives to overthrow an authoritarian dictatorship, and I think we should be tangibly assisting them in doing that, and I think the Europeans would follow our lead if we took a stronger lead in this effort.
Shiraz Maher, are there serious pitfalls, though, to throwing this authoritarian regime in Damascus when the alternative is this, an al-Qaeda-linked Nusra front?
Well, I think that question needs to be challenged, really, in the sense of, that it's not the dichotomy that you present. There is the regime, there is Jabhat al-Nusra, which we have now had confirmed is linked to al-Qaeda, but there is a huge and very broad opposition which really exists across the full spectrum of political opinions that you would expect to see. So some of the opposition figures are liberal, they are secular, they are progressive. Then you have Islamist organizations, the Muslim Brotherhood, and other groups, the Syrian Islamic Front, for example, who are Salafist and inclined that way, but are not directly linked to al-Qaeda, but nonetheless who harbor a very conservative and certainly more austere Islamic interpretation than some other people would like to see.
Sure, there are very many groups fighting on the ground, but certainly would you accept the premise, though, that the announcement this week linking al-Qaeda in Iraq with al-Nusra would weaken the other more quote-unquote moderate, less radical groups fighting as well, that it would actually deny them some more much-needed military aid?
Well, I think that it certainly complicates the position from a practical policy position on the ground, because so far we've adopted this position, the West and the United States, of delivering non-lethal aid. But it's very difficult if we start putting arms into the Syrian conflict, even if we give them to, as it were, quote-unquote, the right people, if we give it to people who are sympathetic to us. Relationships on the ground are pragmatic, they are vociferous, they change from day to day, if not hour to hour. So there's no guarantee that if we were to put in heavy military arms on the ground that were supporting the rebels, that they wouldn't end up in the hands of an organization like Jabhat al-Nusra. And of course, as the general made the point, is very absolutely right. At the moment, you have this stalemate on the ground, and without us going in to tip the balance decisively in favor of the rebels, this situation and this stalemate will just continue. And so it's very difficult to know how we progress and how we move it forward. So to answer your question, it does make the situation much more complicated.
Luay Safi, how much more complicated does it make the situation from your perspective within the Syrian National Coalition? You keep asking for more weapons, but how can you guarantee that you'll be able to, in fact, control the flow of weapons away from these radical groups? It
will make it more complicated, but let us understand the situation. Now, the Nusra is outside of the FSA. FSA is the mainstream, the main fighting force. Nusra is about 5,000 as opposed
because some people would argue that the
90,000.
FSA, the First Syrian Army, doesn't in fact exist, that it's an umbrella organization, a label that very many people say they belong to, but it doesn't have a unified command structure, does it?
It exists as any guerrilla organization exists. It's not like a formal military force with high military discipline. That's true. But it's a force that has come together and worked together and subject to certain rules. Now, the question is now, I mean, what happened now underscore the importance of providing real support to the mainstream fighting force. That has been really denied, and the United States have limited the amount of weapons that the mainstream fighters can receive. While, on the other hand, the Nusra is very well funded. We don't know where the money comes from. We don't know even the names of the leaders of that organization. But the mainstream forces are not well funded.
Fine, you talk about these mainstream forces, the so-called Free Syrian Army, but they themselves have admitted that they collaborate with al-Nusra in the common fight to topple the Assad government. Are you in fact not being opportunistic? And won't this opportunism come back to haunt you eventually if the Assad government falls? Doesn't it alienate large segments of Syrian society, which is very much nationalistic, multi-religious? Doesn't it also alienate Western powers, your supporters?
Not really. I mean, we have a clear vision in the opposition about what we want to do. We don't want a religious state, that's for sure. The FSA has, not the FSA as a leadership and structure, but certain forces within the FSA has collaborated with the Nusra in the past. But 2 days ago, the spokesman of the FSA said clearly that this announcement will end all kind of collaboration, because any force that has allegiance to Al-Qaeda that is located outside the borders of Syria will not be a credible fighting force for us.
General Keane, are we likely to see this ongoing conflict against the government now perhaps turn into a rivalry, a military fight between some of these groups, the more moderate, the more Islamist groups fighting in Iraq? Some say that this is simply the first step, that the goal isn't to remove the government as such. The goal is eventually to turn each other's weapons against each other, jockeying for power, jockeying for control in a post-Assad Syria.
Well, I don't see any of that happening, frankly, prior to deposing Assad. It's just like what you saw take place in Libya. There are very many different militia groups, all had a common enemy in deposing Gaddafi. And in the post-Gaddafi era, in the post-Assad era, I think certainly when it's ripe to take place then. I mean, this is my frustration with my own government. The rise of al-Nusra, supported by Iraqi al-Qaeda fighters, one of the reasons that's taken place is because of our unwillingness to get involved here and support the much more moderate Syrian opposition forces. I'm convinced if we had done that from the beginning, we wouldn't be where we are now with a radical group gaining influence in not only militarily, but also influence in what would be a post-Assad era, which
but
would be, I think, tragic for Syria.
General Keane, look at what happened in Iraq. Are you also burying your heads in the sand, not just you, the U.S. administration, but many of those involved in trying to bring about the Assad government's downfall, yet seeing what the alternative could be once again, another type of conflict, more sectarian, possibly even more lethal. James Clapper, the U.S. head of intelligence, has said that even after the fighting ends, after Damascus falls, this sectarian conflict could in fact go on for 1 year, 18 months, and that may even be a conservative estimate.
Well, certainly that's true. I mean, once these forces are unleashed, it's very difficult to, to control the outcome. You can certainly try to influence it as best you can. But, I mean, the harsh reality is we do have a dictatorial regime in Assad that's been brutal to his people, and the people of Syria are those who rose up, not the countries around Assad, not the United States, not the West. It's the people who are risking their lives to change this government. And I think the risk of supporting those people, even though the outcome is uncertain, is absolutely worth it.
Let me ask Shiraz Maher, why do you think did Al-Qaeda in Iraq decide now to publicly come out and announce its relationship with and influence over al-Nusra? Some people are suggesting that it may have to do with a shifting tide in Washington, not so much an explicit shift in policy, but a tacit change in that the U.S. administration seems to be saying, although we won't support the armed rebellion militarily, we won't provide them any lethal weapons, we will actually acquiesce to even encourage some of our regional allies to do so. And I'm thinking about Turkey, Qatar, of course, and Saudi Arabia.
Well, the timing of this is somewhat curious. There doesn't seem to be an out-and-out obvious explanation. But if we look at the timeline, you see in the first instance, Ayman Zawahiri came out and initially said that he endorses the jihad in Syria, that, as he put it, the brothers in Syria should unite in their ranks and their opposition towards the regime. And that precipitated by a few days the announcement by al-Qaeda in Iraq, which formally said, we are part of Jabhat al-Nusra and these are our fighters. And then you've seen two statements come out from Jabhat al-Nusra in response to that. They seem to have, in the first instance, been caught on the hop. I don't think they initially welcomed or wanted this declaration to have come out and to have been made public. And that certainly seems clear from the two statements they've put out. The first one pulled back a little bit, nonetheless endorsing the relationship with Zawahiri, but pulling back from al-Qaeda in Iraq a little bit. And then in the second statement, again, just backtracking a little bit. So I think Jabhat al-Nusra know best the reality on the ground, the situation in which they find themselves, and they realize there is a potential to alienate other members of the opposition, and they didn't want to do that. But we should also not be naive about what Jabhat al-Nusra are doing on the ground. It is a fact that Jabhat al-Nusra are amongst the better equipped but also the more successful rebel fighters on the ground. They are the ones really inflicting some of the biggest defeats against the regime. So that makes people want to back them because they're the ones making progress. The second point is that the Al-Qaeda we are seeing today in Syria is the new Al-Qaeda. It is the Al-Qaeda that has learned from Iraq, that has learned from the experiences of Afghanistan, and to an extent elsewhere. It is not subjugating the populations. Instead, it's really a masterclass in insurgency. They are working hard to win civilian populations. They're ensuring bread supplies, they're ensuring gas supplies so people can heat their homes. They're essentially trying to look after people in a way that they didn't do in Iraq, and as a result suffered a sort of backlash from the civilian population there. So what you're seeing taking place right now in Syria is actually a very dangerous precedent, because not only do you have an effective military fighting unit in Jabhat al-Nusra, but one that's also smart about trying to win the civilian support for its operations. That's a big problem for the United States and for the rest of us.
And how much of a big problem is it, Louay Safi, for the Syrian National Coalition? How much do you still need Jabhat al-Nusra despite all of this, given the fact that estimates suggest that it represents over 50% of the armed capacity of any of the groups fighting in Syria today?
This estimate is completely wrong. They are probably less than 10% of the total fighting force.
Well, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of the potency that they represent, the organization, the discipline, and so on.
They are effective, and the FSA is trying to improve its effectiveness. The problem, as the General pointed out, you know, our allies have been very reluctant to support, while the allies of the real terrorists in Syria, the Assad regime, is providing a lot of support. And remember, we have now the Hezbollah and the Iranian radicals coming to Syria. And so that creates the sectarian environment where al-Nusra can rise. But I can tell you...
How divergent are your goals? Do you share any of the same goals?
No. Actually, well, I mean, you have to distinguish between two things. On the level of our vision for Syria as a mainstream opposition is completely different than the al-Nusra that has a very limited, and as I said, the religious state will not be acceptable in Syria, number one. Number two, we will not condone the type of tactics used by Al-Qaeda elsewhere. I mean, Jabhat al-Nusra will have to tone down, and it has, as pointed out, its own approach. Now, for us, while we disagree on their vision and on their commitments, we are not in a position to turn this fighting into internal fighting among the opposition. It has to be fixed against the regime. When the regime is gone, I can tell you, unlike Iraq, the Nusra will disappear, because it's a very small part of the entire population.
We'll see if it disappears.
And we have a different population.
Easier said than done, though. But I take the point that you do not share the same goals. Your goals are a pluralistic, democratic Syria. Theirs is an Islamic state. I do want to, if I can, just take the point to General Keane.
One final point. The Syrian population is different than the Iraqi population. And the positioning of al-Nusra is different than the positioning of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so the comparison is very faulty. I don't think Syria will mirror Iraq in any way.
General Keane, if ultimately it comes to a choice between Assad's government or a jihadist and Nusra-dominated Syria, who does the US favor? Is it better the devil you know than the devil you don't?
Well, we wouldn't want either one of those, obviously, and I'm not convinced that's what's going to happen here. I am frustrated by this announcement, because I believe there is a movement inside Washington, D.C. More and more government officials, particularly senators and congressmen, are seeing that lethal aid is really something that's necessary. And what frustrates me about this announcement is it'll give rise to the critics who are so concerned that by providing weapons to the different Syrian opposition groups, they would fall into the wrong hands. And this announcement is going to give credence to those critics, and that's really unfortunate.
And it bolsters, no doubt, the government's narrative that they are fighting groups full of, as they say, terrorists. On this note, we'll have to leave our discussion. Let me thank all our guests, General Jack Keane in Washington, Shiraz Maher in London, and Louay Safi here in the studio. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Syria. Remember, you can always keep up to date with the latest news on Syria at our website at al-Jazeera.com. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team, thanks for watching.